There are two sides to every story. The National Broadcasting Company presents the vivid drama of life itself. Broadcasting's original program of Mediation, the Court of Human Relations. And now, the man who has familiarized millions of people with the idea of mediation helped to make it a creative force in American life. A.L. Alexander.
There is an ancient tale about a king who wanted to pick the wisest men among all his subjects to be his close advisors. When his search narrowed down, he put the two remaining candidates in a room in his palace. In the room door, he had installed a lock, which was the last word in mechanical ingenuity. Whoever was able to devise a method for opening the door would be appointed. Well, I shan't burden you with all the details, but after the two had argued and sweated, disagreed for hours over complicated mechanical formula to discover the proper lock combination, a third party, not personally involved, a little more objective, walked over to the door and turned the handle. The door opened to his touch. It had been unlocked all the time. You know, when we're very close to a situation, our sense of judgment or logic may be completely misdirected. Often in our relationships, when misunderstandings arise, and sometimes the closer we are, the truer it is, emotions, sensitive feelings block all attempts at settlement. It is then that the judgment of impartial persons can be extremely helpful. You're about to witness an actual mediation proceeding, and we are privileged to welcome our distinguished mediators. Theirs is the happy faculty of reducing what appears to be a complicated situation to its simple, essential elements. An eminent member of the American bar, long a justice of the Supreme Court of his native state of New Jersey, Honorable William A. Wachenfeld. Noted authority in the field of education and social ethics, President of Adelphi College, Dr. Paul Dawson Eddy. One of our sanest, wisest, most beloved Americans, Minister Emeritus of Riverside Church, Dr. Harry Emerson Fosdick. Now, here is an issue of timely interest and wide application. It involves a disagreement between the older and younger generations, parents and offspring. Now, here is the complainant.
Well, I agreed to come here today because of my respect for you, Mr. Alexander, and naturally for the board, to settle an issue that's caused quite some controversy between my son and myself. Naturally, a parent wants more than anything else the happiness of his child. But I've been disturbed because my son has been rebellious against advice and guidance.
How old is your son?
My son is 24 years old, and like youth, he thinks he knows it all, knows all the answers, but doesn't always.
Well, what have you as a mother and what have you as parents tried to do for this son?
Well, in the first place, he has really cast aside that age and experience counts for things, but we have tried the best we could to make a really fine man of him. We tried to give him the best of ourselves in every way, to make a useful man, that he'd be happy, a man, useful to himself and useful to the people around him.
Does he listen to anyone?
Well, what astonishes me is that by the hour he'll sit with his contemporaries, his cronies and pals, and listening with bated breath to everything they have to say and taking their advice. But when we, the parents who have his interests most at heart, try to offer him a suggestion, he ignores and resents our suggestions.
Well, now suppose we hear from the respondent's son.
Mr. Alexander and members of the board, I don't think anybody is going to deny the intelligence and experience and wisdom of an older person. But does this necessarily mean that an offspring is a dumb mute incapable of any capacity of independent thinking? I think I can put it very simply. For as far back as I can recall, I have been in the position of constantly being told what is good and what is not good for me. My parents are dedicated to the idea that no young person is capable of rendering a valid decision or a valid judgment. Whether it was the books I read, the schools I went to, the company I kept, whether as an adolescent, a child in fact, or a grown man, the viewpoint of my parents has been that they are, well, virtually the district attorney, the judge, well, the jury of every aspect of my life.
Well, how do you feel about that as the complainant mother?
Well, I don't believe that. I don't believe that. You watch a child grow up, a young man grow up. You know his faults, you know his limitation, you know his capabilities. And the parents can judge, really, we know the pitfalls of life, and we try to advise accordingly.
Well, what do you feel that you've done for this young man?
I feel that we've tried to give him everything of ourselves that we could to make as fine a person of him as we really could.
But in a more specific way, what have you done?
Well, we tried to give him the best of everything. We tried to give him the best schools, and we were in a position to know which were the best schools. We tried to give him the advantages of travel. When he was 10 years old, he crossed the ocean 12 times. He spoke French before he spoke English, and he traveled all over Europe.
And what is so difficult for you to understand?
Well, it's difficult for me to understand why he disregards all our suggestions and advice.
Well, for one thing, my parents seem to have very definite preconceived ideas as to what my relationships with people should be. My instinct, of course, is to associate with people I like.
Well, apparently this conflict is not something of recent origin. Just how long has this been going on? I mean, this idea of you not being able to make your own decisions as you'd like.
Possibly since I was 14 or 15, but even then I felt that I knew what I wanted to do and I knew who I liked, but up to this day my parents seem to think that they know better what and, well, who is good for me.
And what particular question would you like settled?
Well, basically I would like to know whether a parent, simply because he or she possesses a greater number of years and a certain position in life, whether this means that I am to be considered some kind of a half-wit and incapable of any capacity of making up my own mind.
What about the question of mistakes?
Well, I'd like to be able to make my own mistakes without constantly being approached with the attitude of, you know, well, I told you so.
Well, I think we must realize that we must have discipline in life. And I think that we all know what's happened to the youth of today that lack discipline. I mean, the progressive education. And instead of appreciating, we have given him discipline, but instead of appreciating that there can be no responsible person without discipline, you must have discipline, why he's rejected all advice of that nature.
Well, may we ask you this question? Do you consider yourselves parents who are pretty good examples of invoking discipline?
Well, yes, I think so, to some extent.
Well, he seems quite sure of himself.
Well, certainly in looking at him after, and we have given him the benefit of some discipline, you wouldn't think that he was a boy that was cowed, browbeaten by tyrannical parents that robbed him of all initiative. Would you?
Well, we'll have to ask the mediators that in a moment. What question would you like to ask?
Well, I'd just like to know, do you have to be a president of a corporation at the age of 7 in order to have a decision or an opinion and have that opinion respected? I wanted to go to public school, and they made me go to private school. I had a certain boarding school in mind. Before I was born, I was enrolled in another one, and that's where I ended up. I like people because I like them, and, well, my parents want to pick my friends.
You hear that? Your son says that you want to pick his friends.
Well, I know that one of the resentments of my son has been that we tried to have him avoid making mistakes that he'd regret so much in later life. And as an example of that, a recent letter from his father, who was out of town, wrote him a letter that I considered it was a letter written with the greatest love, the deepest understanding, and about a social aspect that would affect him in later life. And the advice was to his benefit. My son took the letter, glanced at it, and cast it aside with scorn.
Well, what are you interested in establishing?
Well, I'm interested in establishing, that these gentlemen would tell me, how much should a youth take of advice from his parents, or must we, the parents, decide that youth knows everything and has all the answers?
Dr. Eddy?
I think you don't have to decide that, but I think we have to recognize that the only way that your son or any child may mature is by having the right of choice within the limits of his age and experience, the opportunity to make up his mind, to learn to solve problems by solving his own, to learn how to get along with people by living with them and playing with them. Now, I think, in spite of whatever this conflict may be, you've done a pretty good job. And I admire the fact that the young man hasn't given up to your well-intentioned desire, as every parent desires for his child, and the best possible. But there's a limit that we as parents can, to which we can go. The child has to become independent. Now, as president of a college, I find that if a student hasn't rebelled, if he isn't trying to find himself, he's not likely to be a personality with strength and initiative. They have to rebel. And we as parents have to know that this is part of the process of growing up. And so I admire your attitude, but I sometimes think that we as parents, in our own interests and needs, for our own fulfillment, and our hopes for our children to be what we would like to have been and perhaps were frustrated in, very often intrude into the sacred orbit of their right to function and to evolve as independent persons, because you won't be with him all the time. Someday he's got to stand alone. He's got to face it alone.
Dr. Eddy, do you feel that a parent can live his or her life through a child?
Well, we all do to a degree, but if we dominate the child, if we control the child, then we weaken his will and his initiative. We do not make a strong offspring. And it's only by making his mistakes, short of being consumed in a fire, he has to learn the stove is hot, and that certain things do not work in society. When he discovers them, then he knows it. He does not know it because somebody tells him.
Dr. Fosdick?
Well, after a lifetime of personal counseling, I've come in general to divide families into three classes. First, there are the families where there is no discipline. The children run wild, and the children come out hoodlums. The second class is at the opposite extreme, where the parents are possessive, where they dominate the child, where the child is run into the pattern of what they want him to be. The motive, love and devotion and dedication, but the method is in general domination. And the result of that is a rebel, resentful against parental authority. The third kind of family is a family where the parents train the child, but with one major objective: to make him independent. The one thing they want is that he should be able to run his own life. And whenever they see a place where they can take their hands off altogether because he's proving to be independently responsible, then they're delighted, for that's what they're aiming
I
at.
believe that. I believe that myself, too.
Well, now,
I mean-
may we ask this, so we don't
Yes.
want to interrupt Dr. Fosdick, and he's going to resume. If you do believe that, why has there been an issue here? I mean, what has been the basis of this issue?
Well, I suppose, perhaps mistakenly, I'm still giving some advice occasionally. Perhaps I shouldn't, but I still have.
Well,
And that's excellent, everything that you've all said.
there's no question at all about the lovely motivation in the parents of this son.
Because
But
they
if
say
this-
that we only always have to learn by our own bitter experiences.
Exactly. But if this is going to be resolved, I think two things have got to happen. In the first place, the parents have got to recognize that it's hands-off, except as cooperative friendliness, can work. This boy evidently feels dominated, but he's 24 years old.
Yes.
Let him make his own mistakes now and learn that way.
Yes.
To the very limit of your ability, I should
Yes.
say, keep your hands off.
Yes.
And
Well,
then I would
excellent
say-
excellent advice, and I shall remember it.
Then I should say to the son that he ought to respond.
But it's hard not to sometimes give advice, isn't it?
Yes, but it depends on how you give it, doesn't it?
Yes.
Well, perhaps we can interpose this question, Dr. Fosdick, and we
Yes.
address the complainant mother. When you give this advice, aren't you concerned with having your son specifically avoid mistakes? You want him to avoid the pitfalls that perhaps you should have avoided
that's,
yourself.
That's
Yes.
always a parent's fault, I think.
And, and particularly,
Okay,
would you say it was your fault?
Well, perhaps, but as you say, you want him to avoid. You want to make as fine a person. I do some painting, and I'm like art very much, and I've often felt that children are like a piece of clay in your hands, in a way, to a certain point. My son won't like that, being an independent character, but it's like as if you were making a statue. I mean, and you give of yourself the best you have. You want so much.
Well, would it be galling
Forgive
to
it.
you, and has it been galling to you, to see your son do something opposite to your point
Yes,
of view?
and sometimes I think that he does it just to be
Well,
May I?
opposite.
but I'd like to just interject a remark here, if I might. I don't think that any young child, let us say until the age of 14 or 15, I'm saying a young child, that resents advice at that age. I think they want to be led. I think they'd be unhappy if they weren't led. I think they'd be problems to themselves and to their own parents. But I think when they reach a certain age, and I'm just taking the age of 14 or 15, then it comes the time when any advice given you personally should be sifted out. You receive the advice graciously, supposedly, then you must take it and sift it to your own likes and dislikes and turn the advice into something useful for yourself. Very often, however, my parents seem to feel that when they give me advice, it has to be followed word by word, and if I don't follow it exactly as it is given, then, well, I'm just not listening to them.
Well, I'm troubled by the mother's figure of that lump of clay, for that is just the way not to treat a child,
Oh, well,
because you're making there
but
a
I
pattern.
really meant that more in a young child. I don't mean a man.
Well, do you recognize
After
now that your son is 24 years old?
Oh, yes, of course.
Well, then what
But
was the
still-
reason for
still,
this
I
mediation?
because I still feel at times that I've been around the world, traveled quite a bit, and met a great many people, and I feel sometimes I can give good advice. I don't force it on him, but it seems to me that he has an idea of resenting
Yes,
the
well,
advice
now-
from me, whereas a boy, a crony, will come in and give him the same idea. In fact, I have been known to say to a friend of his, would you mind telling my son this? And the friend will tell him, and he'd accept the idea. But if I had told him, oh no.
Well, now we address the son. What about that letter? You don't have to go into the personal details, but we understand that you looked without a disdain upon a letter which was sent to you in your apparent interest.
Yes, I didn't read it at all, to be very truthful.
Well, how
It was
about
a
that?
it was a traumatic time at that point, and I wasn't prepared to read anything and listen to anybody. It's one that we possibly all go through. I wasn't being reasonable, possibly. Now I suppose I would read the letter, but at that moment, in a state of
Well, I've
excitement
kept it for when
and
you're
such,
older, that you could keep it as a very
I wasn't prepared,
fine letter from your father.
Fine letters are wonderful, and we can all write them, but sometimes it isn't followed through. You feel something and you say something one moment, and then you turn around and lash back at somebody the next moment. And I am speaking now of, attitude that my parents have towards me at times, and then you lash out and then expect to have your children turn around and say, well, all is forgiven. I know you didn't mean it, and I know you haven't meant it for 20 years or 24 years, and I forgive you. But it isn't quite as easy as all that. Nothing ever is black and white in that.
May I say something in a lighter vein, in the midst of even these serious gentlemen, that I come from a family of New Englanders, and my mother used to say that until she was 40 years old, even if she'd been back and forth to Europe, her father still said, now remember to wear your rubbers when it's raining. So, don't you see, it does come natural sometimes, doesn't it?
Well, now we've reserved Dr.
And he's
Fosdick.
looking so very serious. And I'm a little worried.
Dr. Fosdick,
Yes,
have you
never
anything further to say? We interrupted you several times.
Well, simply that I wish this could be resolved, but if it's going to be resolved, there's got to be a change on both sides.
Yes.
That is to say, the parents have
I'm
got
sure
to
you're right.
recognize that this son is 24 years old. He's a grown man. He has a right to make his own choices, and they'd better keep their hands off. If they can be cooperatively friendly.
I don't think I'll go
fine.
home tonight.
But then I'd should say to the son that despite all his complaints about method, his parents have given him a mighty fine start. That thousands of other
He's had
boys would
opportunities.
have prayed to have, and that he has.
He has.
And that if the father and mother will change their attitude and stop dominating, you change your attitude from resentfulness to affectionate gratitude.
Judge
And if you could
Walkenfeld.
work it out that way.
Thank you for that last.
Well, I think you've solved this problem without any assistance from me. But you don't need to worry about this boy. He wears rubbers when they need it. He impresses me very, very much. He's cultured, he's refined, and he's effective, and you should be proud of him.
I am
But
very.
we're talking about general principles, and I think we can put our finger on it. When a son has too much supervision and the advice is too constant, he rebels automatically. He feels as though his initiative has been wiped out, his independence is gone, and he resents it. He wouldn't be full of red blood if he didn't. There are
Very.
every father and mother, the more they're devoted to their child and their boy, the more careful they will be that that unfortunate result doesn't come about. There are certain things that parents have to be strict with their children. When it comes to obeying the law and the custom of our people, the health codes and things of that kind, obedience is mandatory. But when it comes to other things in life, such as choosing a career, his associates and his friends, he has a voice, and a very strong voice, in that conclusion. And when he reaches those equations, if you will just show to him the little cooperation that you expected from him, you'll find that your problems will disappear. This boy is a fine boy. He's perfectly capable of taking care of himself.
Very proud.
At 24, he's matured and very impressive.
The viewpoint of the board on this issue is very clear. It has been emphasized that the true function of parents in this instance, or any instance, is not to live or relive the life of the parent through the present life of a child, that the true purpose of a parent is to train a child to cope with the conditions of life, to cooperate, to help him to learn to stand on his own feet and have a sense of independence. Now we know that this son must be grateful for all the things that have been done for him, all the wonderful opportunities he's had in the way of education, and in many ways opportunities that many young men do not have. But this board emphasizes that if there are mistakes to be made, it is the son that must recognize them and adjust them, that once the parents have done their best to guide and advise, their obligation is fulfilled. Nothing further can or should be done. That to insist on doing so serves no purpose other than to create bitterness, in fact, invite the very rebellion that is so resented. As we express our thanks to our mediators and look forward to another session of the Court of Human Relations, I think of the urgent need for attitudes of harmony and cooperative effort in our everyday living, and of the warming admonition of Longfellow, which, when paraphrased, applies to every aspect of human relations. All your strength is in your union. All your danger is in discord. Therefore be at peace henceforward, and in friendship live together.